When chaos breaks out mid-air, one blind girl and her dog become the last line of hope, but can they save everyone? The airport buzzed with the kind of energy that signaled journeys beginning, paths crossing. Jane's fingers curled around Max's harness as they weaved through the crowds, Sylvia gently guiding her daughter with a steady hand on her shoulder. Max, a sleek, amber-eyed Labrador, matched Jane's pace. He was trained not only to lead her, but to calm her, an unwavering companion who seemed to sense her every breath and heartbeat. Sylvia glanced at her daughter, a twinge of pride and protectiveness in her eyes. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, giving her shoulder a light squeeze. Jane tilted her head, focusing on the sounds around her. The announcements, the hum of escalators, footsteps scattering in all directions. "Feels big," she answered, a slight tremor in her voice. "And kinda loud." Sylvia chuckled. "Big, yes, and loud. You're not wrong." She rubbed her daughter's shoulder, then leaned down and whispered, "But Max has got your back, right?" Jane nodded, brushing her fingers through the fur on Max's head. "Always." As they reached their gate, Jane heard the murmur of nearby travelers, the occasional sound of laughter, and the crinkle of plastic wrappers. The airport, though daunting, was something she could piece together by sound. It was a world layered in audio clues, and Jane was used to navigating it. But this was the first time she'd be boarding a plane. A giant bird, her mum had described. She felt a mixture of excitement and an unnamed worry. Max, as usual, seemed calm, nose twitching as he took in the mingling smells. A flight attendant with a deep, reassuring voice introduced himself as Clark, bending down to talk directly to Jane. "First time on a plane?" he asked, the warm tone cutting through the usual formalities. Jane nodded. "Yeah, and Max's first time too." "Well, Max looks like a pro already," Clark replied with a smile that Jane couldn't see but could sense. "And you'll both be just fine. Promise." Once they boarded, Clark led them to their seats, making sure Jane and Max were comfortable before stepping away. Sylvia helped Jane with her seatbelt, adjusting it until her daughter looked as settled as she could. Jane shifted, feeling the firm grip of the seat around her, the unfamiliar vibrations as the engines hummed to life. She patted Max's side, trying to focus on the warmth of his fur to ground herself. But as the engines roared to a full hum, Max began to shift, his ears pricking up, nose twitching with sudden sharp focus. He sniffed the air, tilting his head as if trying to identify a scent that shouldn't be there. His body tensed beside Jane, a change so slight only she would have noticed. "Mom?" Jane's voice was low, tentative. She could feel Max's tension. It radiated up through the harness into her hand. Sylvia looked down at the dog, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong, buddy?" She reached out, but Max's attention remained on the air around them. He was sniffing it cautiously, almost as if it had a strange smell he didn't quite trust. Jane's grip on the harness tightened. "Do you think he knows something?" Sylvia gave a reassuring smile, though her eyes flicked over Max again with slight concern. "Oh, he's just not used to the plane, honey. It's probably all the new smells. Airports are loud, busy places, right?" "Yeah, I guess," Jane whispered, her fingers brushing over Max's tense shoulders. But as the plane began to roll forward, a sliver of unease crawled under her skin. She couldn't see the plane accelerating, but she felt it, a low, throbbing rush that made her chest tighten. Before long, Clark passed by, making his final checks before takeoff. Sylvia stopped him, nodding toward the dog. "Max seems a little unsettled," she mentioned, careful not to sound alarmed. "He usually doesn't act like this." Clark leaned down, studying Max with an attentive eye. "It's common," he said, his tone reassuring. Dogs aren't exactly used to the sound and vibration of takeoff, especially sensitive ones like Max, but he'll settle in soon enough, I'm sure. Jane bit her lip, focusing on Clark's voice as he spoke. His calmness helped, but it didn't quite erase the chill that had settled in her. Max was calm, but Max didn't scare easily. The plane began its steady rise, pressing her back into her seat. She reached for her mother's hand, gripping it tightly as she felt her stomach lurch with the ascent. "Flying's a bit like a roller coaster, you know," Sylvia murmured, trying to distract her. "That little dip at the start. It's just the beginning." "Yeah," Jane whispered, trying to sound braver than she felt. She turned her face toward the window, though she could only feel the shift in altitude, the drop in her stomach as they climbed higher. Her other hand rested on Max's side, steady and warm. Max, still alert, sniffed again, ears flicking. His nose twitched at something faint and unfamiliar, something that made him tense once more. Jane couldn't see his worry, but she felt it like a pulse in the silence around them. A beat she couldn't ignore. And for the first time since they boarded, she wondered if this flight was as simple and safe as it was supposed to be. The plane had leveled out, and the faint hum of the engines became a steady backdrop. Most of the passengers settled in, unbuckling seatbelts, flipping open magazines, and sinking into the familiar routines of a long flight. Jane felt Max, her therapy dog, relax beside her, his head resting on her feet. The quietness of the cabin started to lull her, and her mother, Sylvia, leaned back with a gentle sigh, one hand on Jane's shoulder. But just as the calm was setting in, Max jerked up, his body tense. He sniffed the air, his tail stiff, and let out a loud, sharp bark that broke through the hum of the engines. Jane tightened her hold on his leash, frowning slightly. Max wasn't one to make noise without reason, and she could feel his alertness pulsing through the tautness of his muscles. "Max," Jane whispered, running a hand down his back. "What's wrong, boy?" Nearby, passengers began murmuring, some glancing over with annoyed expressions. A man across the aisle shot them a pointed look, clearly irritated. "Keep your dog quiet, please," he muttered, half under his breath, but loud enough for Sylvia to hear. Sylvia forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry. He's usually well-behaved." But Max wasn't about to sit down. He turned his body toward the back of the plane, his ears perked, eyes fixated as if he were zeroing in on something specific. He let out another bark, his gaze unwavering, nose twitching with a clear intensity. That's when Clark, the flight attendant, noticed. He walked down the aisle, bending slightly as he approached Jane and her mother. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, casting a quick, trained glance at Max. Clark's tone was professional, but tinged with curiosity. He'd seen animals act up before, but there was something about Max's focus that caught his attention. "Mr. Clark," Jane spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Max doesn't usually bark like this. He's trained to stay quiet." Clark looked from Jane to Sylvia, and then down at Max. The dog was still staring toward the back of the plane, and Clark found himself following Max's line of sight, but he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. "He's very good at sensing things," Jane continued, her tone taking on a kind of quiet authority. "Once, he saved us from a fire at home. He smelled it before anyone noticed." Clark raised an eyebrow, considering her words. "A fire, you say?" "Yes. It was just a small one in the kitchen, but if he hadn't barked, we wouldn't have known until it was too late." Jane's fingers wrapped around Max's collar, giving him a comforting scratch. "If Max is barking like this, he's trying to tell us something." For a moment, Clark hesitated. Protocol urged him to maintain calm, reassure passengers, keep situations controlled. But Jane's insistence and Max's behavior tugged at a deep-seated instinct, one that he'd honed from years of training but rarely had to use. Max's fixation on the rear of the plane, the way he didn't flinch or falter, it wasn't just a dog acting out. "All right," Clark murmured, giving a curt nod. "Let's take a look." He gestured for Max to lead, and sure enough, the dog moved immediately, guiding them both toward the back of the plane. Clark kept a close eye on Max, following as the dog sniffed the air, moving purposefully down the aisle. Jane held onto her mother's arm, listening closely, her head tilted slightly, as if trying to catch something only she could hear. They reached the rear of the plane, near the sealed door to the fuel compartment. Clark glanced around, noting the passengers watching them with curious eyes, some looking more annoyed than concerned. Then, just as Clark was about to turn back, Jane raised her hand. "Wait." She turned her head, focusing, her brows knitting together. I think I hear something." Clark paused, straining his ears, but heard nothing except the dull hum of the engines and the low murmurs of passengers. "What do you mean, Jane?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. It's faint," she said, almost to herself. "But there's this cracking sound like something under pressure." Her voice softened, and her grip on Max's leash tightened. Clark tried again to listen, but all he could hear was the normal ambient noise. Still, there was a gravity in Jane's expression, one that told him she wasn't imagining things. He trusted Jane because he had heard that blind people had much better hearing than other people. Clark had been trained not to ignore any situation, and his instincts told him that this was not normal. Without another word, he stepped away, heading quickly toward the cockpit. He knocked, then entered, finding the captain and co-pilot scanning over their instruments. "Sir, I think we might have a situation," Clark said, keeping his voice low but urgent. The captain's brows furrowed. "What kind of situation?" Clark took a steadying breath. "I believe there may be a fuel leak. I know it sounds unusual, but there's a passenger, a young girl. Her therapy dog sensed something off near the back, and she says she can hear something unusual." The captain exchanged a look with the co-pilot, a mix of concern and caution. He tapped a few controls, scanning the instrument panel for any irregularities. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's get a closer look, and prepare the passengers for an emergency procedure, just in case." Clark nodded, the weight of his responsibility pressing down as he left the cockpit. The atmosphere inside the cabin had been calm until Clark, the head flight attendant, caught a glimpse of the captain's tense expression as he approached. Clark stepped aside from his duties, carefully moving toward the cockpit. Behind the closed door, the crew's voices were low but intense. "Clark, there's an issue with fuel pressure, possibly a leak," the captain said, keeping his voice steady but leaving no doubt of the gravity in his tone. "We'll need to prepare for an emergency landing, and we're coordinating now with the nearest control tower." His gaze, firm and focused, met Clark's. "We need you to inform the crew and keep the passengers calm." Clark nodded. He'd handled emergencies before, but he'd never seen the captain look quite like this. Measured, yes, but as though weighing the very balance of their lives on a razor's edge. In the hushed silence that followed the announcement, tension settled over the passengers like an invisible cloud, thick and suffocating. The hum of the engines, usually a comforting background sound, now seemed ominous, reminding everyone that they were miles above the earth with nowhere to go if something went wrong. The crew, always polished and composed, now wore the tight expressions of people who knew more than they were saying. People trying to keep their own worries tucked away behind carefully trained smiles. The calm didn't last long. Then came the first shudder. The plane dipped, sending a collective gasp through the passengers as the overhead bins rattled. Suitcases and bags tumbled out, thudding onto the floor. Clark braced himself, gripping onto the nearest seat as he fought to keep his voice steady. The passengers needed calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, his voice as even as he could manage, "please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But his words barely registered before a second, stronger jolt rocked the plane. This time, the cabin lights flickered, sputtered once, twice, and then plunged everyone into darkness. "Mum!" Jane's voice was barely a whisper, her hands fumbling to find Sylvia's arm. Sylvia pulled her daughter close, one arm around Jane and the other holding Max's collar as tightly as she could. She didn't know what was happening, only that it was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Max whimpered, his usually calm demeanor shaken by the confusion and fear pressing in from every side. The pitch blackness turned the cabin into a surreal, terrifying scene. Passengers' faces, lit sporadically by the distant flashes of lightning from outside, looked ghostly, their wide eyes and strained expressions barely visible in the gloom. All around, people were shouting, their voices rising in desperation as the plane rocked again, tilting them sideways. A young mother clutched her crying baby. A couple gripped each other's hands in a silent plea, and a man at the back mumbled prayers, his voice trembling. In the chaos, Clark's voice cut through, loud and firm. "Masks will drop from above your seats. Please put them on immediately and help others if you can." As if on cue, the oxygen masks dropped, dangling from above like surreal yellow vines in the dim light. Clark moved quickly, securing his own mask before rushing to help others. But his gaze kept darting towards the back, towards the source of that awful smell. He knew time was running out. Jane could hear the murmurs, the sounds of people moving frantically, and the hushed panic around her. She clung to Sylvia, feeling Max's steady, warm body pressed against her legs. Despite her fear, she felt a strange clarity, a sense of every tiny sound, of every breath and shift around her. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sylvia whispered, her voice steady, but only because she willed it to be. "Just hold on tight. We're going to be okay." The plane shuddered again, a long, stomach-churning descent that made people scream. The roar of the engines rose, filling the space like a giant, angry beast they couldn't escape. Sylvia held Jane close, her own heart racing as she fought to stay calm. Beside them, Max was silent but alert, pressing against them as if his very presence could offer protection. Clark moved through the aisles as best he could, his hands steady, his voice calm, as he helped people with their masks, reassuring them with a touch or a few kind words. "It's all right," he said to a terrified woman clutching her husband's hand. "We're trained for this. Just keep your mask on and stay buckled. We're going to get you down safe." And though his words were comforting, he felt the pulse of fear in his own chest, a beat that seemed to echo in time with the shudders of the plane. He knew the situation was grave. If the fuel leak had reached the engines, the time to act was growing shorter by the second. Back in her seat, Jane clutched her mask, the small plastic edges pressing against her hands as she felt her mother's arms holding her tightly. She could feel Max's weight against her feet, his warmth a steady reminder that he was there, as he always had been. In the darkness, her world was reduced to touch and sound, a heightened sense of every breath, every creak of the plane. "We're with you," Sylvia whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor that ran through it. "Just keep breathing. We'll be down soon." Above the cries, the sounds of whispers and prayers, Clark's voice broke through again. "Everyone, please stay calm. We're doing everything we can to get you down safely." And though he fought to keep his voice steady, he knew they were in a race against time, a battle with gravity and fate that none of them could fully control. The hum of the engines deepened into a harsh, unsteady roar as the plane began its descent. Inside the cabin, tension coiled around each passenger like a vice, squeezing harder with every second. The lights had dimmed, and with each tilt of the aircraft, there came a groan, metal against metal, ominous sounds rising from the belly of the plane, where the fuel was stored. As the descent grew steeper, Clark moved quickly through the aisles, his face a picture of controlled calm as he checked on passengers. But there was no hiding the unease in his eyes. People gripped the armrests or each other, faces drained of color, murmuring desperate prayers or clinging to loved ones. One elderly woman clutched her rosary, beads slipping through her fingers as she whispered under her breath, her eyes shut tight. Across the aisle, a young couple held hands, fingers white from the force of their grip. The cabin was filled with the quiet but unrelenting sounds of fear, suppressed sobs, muffled cries, and the occasional whimper escaping from passengers too exhausted to keep their anxiety bottled up. Jane sat close to her mother, feeling the world's tension seep into her skin, her heart beating fast beneath her small frame. She couldn't see the panic in people's eyes, but she felt it in the air, thick and electric, like the crackling silence before a storm. Her mother's voice was a soft murmur beside her, a low hum of comfort, but Jane could hear the strain. Sylvia tried to reassure her with steady words, holding her daughter's hand firmly, though her own was trembling. We're just coming down a little early, honey," Sylvia whispered, her voice just above a breath. "The crew knows what they're doing. It's all going to be okay. We'll be on the ground soon." But Jane could tell. Her mother was scared too. Sylvia's hand, usually so sure and calm, was as tense as a coiled spring. Jane reached down to stroke Max's fur, her fingers digging into his thick, warm coat, as much for her comfort as for his. Max leaned against her, a solid, calming presence that she could feel even in the pitch-black world she lived in. His ears twitched, alert, but his body was a steady weight against her side, grounding her. "Good boy, Max," Jane murmured, her voice so low only he could hear it. "You're here. We're okay." Max's nose nudged her hand, a warm reassurance. Though she couldn't see his calm, steady eyes, she knew he was watching over her. The comfort was mutual. Her small hands, trembling slightly, soothed him as he steadied her in return. Outside the window, land loomed closer, but the plane's descent was anything but smooth. Clark's voice came over the intercom, trying to calm everyone, but the words seemed to disappear, swallowed by the roar and shake of the aircraft as it fought its way downward. "Hold on tight, everyone. We're almost there. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. This is standard procedure for an emergency descent," Clark's voice echoed, strong but barely masking his own tension. In the moments before landing, the cabin was filled with a mix of silence and whispers, a tension so sharp you could almost feel it thrumming in the air. Clark moved to his station, the muscles in his jaw tight as he watched the cabin, ready to spring into action. The flight attendants fastened themselves into their seats, their eyes wide but focused, hands gripping the edges of their seats as they braced for landing. With a final bone-shaking shudder, the plane's wheels hit the tarmac, bouncing once before they locked down hard onto the runway. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, and then came the release, a sigh, a cry, the sounds of bodies slumping back in relief as the plane finally rolled to a stop. For a moment, everyone sat in stunned silence, disbelief and relief washing over them. Clark's voice came over the intercom, his tone laced with the relief he could finally let show. "Thank you, everyone, for your patience and cooperation. We're safe on the ground, but please remain seated. We'll be evacuating shortly through the emergency exits." Yet the calm was fleeting. Outside, from somewhere beneath the wings, a dull hiss began to grow, a sound that set Clark and the crew into swift action. He nodded sharply to his team, his voice urgent but controlled as he directed them toward the emergency exits. The flight attendants sprang into motion, unlocking the doors and deploying the emergency slides with precision. Clark moved quickly, signaling to passengers and helping guide them toward the exits, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "Everyone, please exit the aircraft quickly and calmly. Follow the crew's instructions and move away from the plane as soon as you're on the ground." 5. Smoke filled the air, dense and choking, as passengers stumbled over themselves in a desperate attempt to escape the narrow aisle. Panic had taken hold, and each movement was fast, jerky, instinct-driven. Clark, the lead attendant, felt the cold sweat trickling down her spine as she urged people forward, her voice steady, even as her heart thundered. Then, from somewhere behind her, there was an explosion, a sound so fierce it was like the sky itself had cracked open. A rush of heat radiated through the cabin, followed by a flash of orange that painted the walls in terror. Flames burst from the rear of the plane, spilling outward like an angry, living creature. Screams and cries filled the air, sharp and piercing. Clark's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm, to meet each passenger's terrified eyes with assurance. "Keep moving! Quickly! Everyone! Follow me!" In the chaos, Jane clung to her mother, Sylvia's arms wrapped tightly around her daughter, as if her own body could shield Jane from the growing danger. "Mom, what's happening?" Jane's voice was barely a whisper, trembling as she buried her face against her mother's shoulder. Despite being blind, Jane could sense the turmoil around her, the desperate breaths, the pushing bodies, and her heart pounded in sync with the fearful energy that filled the cabin. Sylvia held her even closer, the words catching in her throat. She didn't dare speak her fear. She felt Max, Jane's therapy dog, pressing his warm body against them, his sturdy frame like a grounding anchor amid the storm. He was steady, guiding them through the madness. "We're okay, sweetheart," Sylvia murmured, forcing her voice to remain calm. "We're getting out. Just hold on to me and let Max guide us." They moved forward, inch by inch, Max's instinct leading them to the emergency exit as Clark and the other crew members cleared the way. Around them, the aisle was a river of panic, passengers pushing past one another, the strong smell of burning metal and fuel filling the air. Some were crying, others screaming, their faces twisted in terror as they stumbled towards the light. Finally, they reached the emergency chute, Clark standing firm at the exit, guiding each passenger as they slid down to safety. She reached for Sylvia, her hand resting on her shoulder for just a moment, her eyes catching Jane's sightless ones with an understanding that went unspoken. "You two go together, okay? Max will know what to do." With a shaky breath, Sylvia nodded, and with Clark's steady hand guiding them, she and Jane, alongside Max, slid down the chute, landing with a jolt on the tarmac below. They scrambled to their feet, and as they moved further away, Sylvia dared a glance back at the plane. The flames were licking hungrily at the body of the aircraft, black smoke swirling up into the sky, devouring everything in its path. More passengers slid down the chute, collapsing in relief as they hit the ground, some crying, some clutching onto one another as if clinging to life itself. Clark stayed by the exit until the very last person was safely outside, her gaze firm, refusing to show fear as she assisted each one of them. It was only when the last passenger was clear that Clark herself finally escaped, running to join the rest of the crowd as they gathered at a safe distance. As Sylvia held Jane close, she looked around at the other passengers, their faces lit by the orange glow of the burning plane. Tears streamed down cheeks, hands shook uncontrollably, and whispers of prayers filled the air. The reality was sinking in. They had survived barely, escaping the jaws of death with seconds to spare. Some passengers clung to each other, their eyes wide and unseeing, still trapped in the terror of what had almost been. Jane, feeling her mother's tears on her cheek, reached up to wipe them away. "We're okay, right, Mum?" she asked, her voice a quiet echo in the overwhelming silence that followed the chaos. She stroked Max's fur, and he nudged her hand in a gentle reassurance. Sylvia nodded, a sob catching in her throat as she held her daughter's hand tighter. "Yes, sweetheart. We're okay. We're safe now." Her voice was steady, but inside, waves of gratitude mixed with the tremor of fear that refused to leave. They had been so close, too close, and if it hadn't been for Jane, for Max's sharp instinct, who knew what might have happened? As the last flames consumed the aircraft, Clark joined them, her face streaked with ash and sweat. She caught Sylvia's eye, her gaze filled with a deep, unspoken gratitude. She knelt down beside Jane, reaching out to place a hand on Max's head, her voice filled with awe and exhaustion. "Thank you, Jane. And Max. We all owe you so much." Around them, the murmurs of relief grew, and one by one, passengers began to hold hands, forming a circle of survivors. Together, they shared in that moment, bound by a shared sense of fate, of a life that had almost been lost and was now theirs again, fragile, but held on to with all the strength they had left. The scene on the tarmac was something no one would forget. As the flames roared behind them, passengers gathered, some with eyes wet with relief, others with faces pale from the realization of how close they had come to tragedy. Word traveled fast, how the little girl and her dog had sensed the danger, how she had spoken up in her gentle but determined way, and how it had saved them all. Clark, the flight attendant, couldn't shake the mix of awe and gratitude he felt. He approached Jane, who stood quietly with Max by her side. Her face, although marked with a trace of shyness, held a certain strength that made him smile. She didn't look like someone who'd saved over 100 lives. She looked like a girl waiting for reassurance that everything was all right. Kneeling down to her level, Clark spoke softly, his voice carrying a warmth that felt like a thank you, all on its own. "Jane, I don't think we'd be standing here if it weren't for you and Max. You're incredibly brave, you know that." Jane shifted, glancing down at Max, who nudged her hand as if to comfort her. I think it was mostly Max. He knew something was wrong. I just listened," she murmured, cheeks flushing. "Well, that's what bravery is, isn't it?" Clark replied gently. "You listened when others wouldn't have. And you trusted Max. That's not something everyone would do." People around them were whispering about the story, exchanging amazed glances and sharing pieces of the tale as they'd heard it. One by one, passengers began clapping, the sound growing, building up like a wave of gratitude and admiration. Jane blinked, looking around in surprise as the applause spread, directed at her and her faithful friend. The sudden attention made her cheeks grow even warmer, but she couldn't help smiling a little, feeling proud but still just slightly bewildered. Beside her, Sylvia held her daughter's hand, pride shining in her eyes as she watched her little girl being celebrated. Max seemed to pick up on the emotion, wagging his tail proudly, his gaze darting from Jane to the crowd as if sensing the happiness they all felt. A few passengers approached, phones in hand, asking if they could take a photo with Jane and Max, wanting to capture the moment that felt like something out of a storybook. Clark stepped back, giving Jane a reassuring nod, his own chest swelling with pride as he watched the little girl handle the attention with a mix of humility and quiet confidence. She had, in her own way, become a hero, and it was clear that each person who took a picture or exchanged a word with her felt the gravity of what she had done. The airline representative soon arrived, hurrying over to where Jane and her mother stood. With a formal yet deeply appreciative tone, she extended a small box wrapped with a blue ribbon to Jane, her voice catching with emotion. "Jane, Max, today you saved lives. We can never fully repay you for your courage and your trust in each other, but we would like to honor you as a symbol of bravery and teamwork." Opening the box, Jane found a gleaming plaque engraved with her and Max's names, along with a medal of bravery for her to wear. She ran her fingers over the metal, tracing the words as she absorbed their meaning, feeling her heart swell with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Max nudged her hand, his quiet warmth grounding her. Sylvia placed her hand on Jane's shoulder, her voice soft with emotion. "Sweetheart, you and Max, you really did something incredible today." Jane looked up at her mom, then back down at Max. I think Max is the real hero," she said with a shy smile, leaning down to hug him close. "He's always looking out for me. He makes me feel safe, like nothing bad can happen when he's around." The airline representative smiled, wiping away a tear. "Well, the two of you are quite the team. We'd love for you both to know that you'll always be welcome on our flights, with complimentary tickets for a year, so you can travel anywhere you like, together." The crowd cheered, the applause swelling again as Jane beamed, her joy as genuine as it was modest. She held the plaque close, feeling the cool metal under her fingers as a tangible reminder of what she and Max had done. Today wasn't just a day for survival. It was a day for courage, for loyalty, and for a bond that went beyond words. As the crowd dispersed, Clark knelt once more, looking at Jane with the kind of admiration that few would ever truly earn. "You know, Jane," he said quietly, "not everyone gets to be a hero, but today, you and Max, you were exactly what we all needed." And for the first time, Jane's smile stretched wide, her hand resting on Max's head, knowing that, in this moment, she and her best friend were part of something extraordinary. As the plane touched down and the familiar sights of home came into view, Jane leaned into her mother's arms, feeling a weight lifting from her small shoulders. They had made it home. Sylvia wrapped her arm around Jane, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. Max lay curled at Jane's feet, his head resting gently on her shoes, his breathing steady, as though all the worries of the past days had finally released their grip. The airline staff, who had witnessed Max's bravery and Jane's unshakable spirit, made sure the journey was seamless, offering support at every step of the way. Once they exited the plane, the brightness of the airport lights felt welcoming, and Jane could sense a different kind of energy around her. A cluster of staff members, travelers, and curious onlookers had gathered, whispering and gesturing in awe at the little girl and her loyal dog who had saved them all. Jane couldn't see the smiles or hear the hushed praises clearly, but she could feel their warmth, their gratitude pressing into the space around her, settling like a comforting blanket. "Are you okay, my love?" Sylvia asked, gently brushing Jane's hair back from her face. Jane smiled, nodding. "I think I am, Mom. I really think I am." Together, they made their way through the terminal, Max leading them in his calm, confident way, steering Jane gently as if he knew just how much she needed the reassurance of his presence. Jane's mind lingered on the events of the flight, on the weighty feeling that had filled the cabin, the dark silence before the chaos, and then the spark of courage that had lit within her, growing with each steady breath Max had taken. She had always known he was special, but now everyone else did too. Once home, they were greeted with open arms by family, neighbors, and friends. People had already heard the story, and they gathered around Jane and Max, eager to express their admiration and pride. The story had spread. Newspapers, local news, even online articles were telling the tale of how a brave little girl and her remarkable dog had saved a plane full of lives. "Oh, sweetheart," her grandmother said, her voice thick with emotion as she wrapped Jane in a long, warm embrace. "You've done something most grown-ups would be too afraid to even imagine." Max, sitting patiently by Jane's side, received gentle pats, scratches, and even a few treats as tokens of gratitude from those gathered. Little by little, Jane realized the impact of what they'd done. Though she couldn't see their faces, she felt the admiration in each hug, in every word of thanks, every gift given to Max. For the first time, she truly understood that she was capable of helping others even without her sight. "Mom," Jane said one evening, sitting on their porch with Max curled up by her side, "I thought I was just a girl who couldn't see. But Max, he showed me there's more to me, didn't he?" Sylvia knelt beside her, holding Jane's hands in her own. "Yes, honey. You showed all of us what's inside you. Courage, kindness, and a heart big enough to help others. Max may have been your eyes, but you were the one with the bravery to trust him, to listen to what was inside you." Jane felt a rush of warmth, something she couldn't quite name, spreading from her chest to her fingertips. She had felt scared. But somehow, with Max by her side, she'd found the strength to face that fear. And now, as she sat in the cool evening air, the sounds of crickets filling the silence, she realized that courage didn't have to be something big or loud. It was quiet, steady, like the sound of Max's breathing beside her. Their story traveled far beyond their small town, becoming a symbol of hope and trust in one's instincts. People from across the country began reaching out, sending letters and messages of admiration, sharing stories of their own therapy animals, of moments when they had felt courage rise within them in the face of fear. Jane's heart swelled every time she read those messages, and she knew that Max was more than her eyes. He was her strength, her partner, and her friend. As the weeks passed, Jane's life returned to its gentle rhythms, but now there was a quiet confidence within her. She walked a little taller, spoke with a steadiness that surprised even her. She knew that even in the moments when life seemed dark, she had Max, her family, and a well of courage she hadn't known was hers to draw from. Everywhere they went, people recognized Jane and Max, sometimes stopping them to say thanks or share a story of how they had been inspired by their bravery. Max became a local hero, his loyalty and sensitivity known to everyone. In the years that followed, Jane would look back on that day, feeling the strength that had grown within her. She and Max had shown the world that courage, love, and a little bit of faith could carry anyone through the darkest of moments. And that's the incredible story of Jane and her loyal friend Max, their courage and unbreakable bond that not only saved their lives, but became a beacon of hope and inspiration for so many people around the world. Stories like this remind us of the power within, of the quiet strength we all hold, and the life-changing love we share with our animals. If this story touched you, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming stories of bravery, resilience, and the beautiful connections that keep us going. And tell us in the comments, what's a moment in your life when courage found you in the dark? Or how has a pet helped you through tough times? Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay inspired, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next story. Take care.